Stephen King, my favorite author of all time. I have a whole shelf dedicated to the man back there. I'm on a quest to read every book that he has ever published. I'm about 50 deep so far, so I still got a little bit of a ways to go because the man is prolific. He's written action, he's written fantasy, he's written horror, he's written coming of age, sci-fi, family dramas, historical fiction. And he's a master at all of them, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion, right? I'm going to look at things with rose-colored glasses because he is my favorite. I'm going to be biased. Now, there is criticism that is founded. There's also criticism that is unfounded. So I figured that I would read you and react to some Stephen King 1-star reviews of his most popular novels. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I'm a composer, now also a booktuber. You can find my music in the Wheel of Time Season 2 and 3, His Dark Materials Season 3, and the newly released Blessed Be the Eternal, the Edan trilogy main theme for Philip Chase's wonderful fantasy series. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Stephen King, because I love the guy. I am going to be biased because I appreciate not only his masterpieces, but even his messier works. Ones where it was very apparent that he was under the influence of some substances, or he hadn't planned things out maybe as well. Or the ending maybe have fallen a little flat. The rough around the edges aspect of his books are kind of part of his charm, in my opinion. But I understand that those can be criticisms for people. But I also understand that there's sometimes criticisms that, in my opinion, are unfounded or are downright hilarious. So I figured it would be kind of a fun video this time to read and react to some 1-star reviews of his most popular novels. So I chose 6 novels. I might expand this out and make this a video series. I don't know. You let me know in the comments if that's something you'd want to see. I'm just trying this out as a little bit of an experiment because, favorite authors, you're going to see things in a different light from what other people do. So if you like this kind of video, please like and subscribe. And now on to the books. So quick caveat before I get started, I'm only going to react to 1-star reviews of books I've actually read because I want to be able to provide context for you, let you know if this is something I agree with, something I don't agree with, and I would also love to know your opinion because I'm sure our opinions will overlap in some respects. They will differ in other respects, and I would love to know kind of what your thoughts are as well. So leave it in the comments and let me know after you watch this video if you agree, disagree. We could agree to disagree. We could agree to agree. It's all safe space here to talk about books, whether we agree or not. So let's get on to the books here. So I'm going to pull up the first batch of reviews here I found. This is for The Gunslinger. This is Dark Tower Book 1. This is one of those ones where it started off with one of the best first lines in any book, in my opinion. And then, of course, it becomes a little bit uneven. It is his most weakest entry in the Dark Tower series. I think it is the shortest one, but he had also written it, I think, starting in 1970. He was very much a young writer at the time. It didn't get published until 1982 as a vignette of short stories that were interconnected. So, it's very different to the rest of the Dark Tower series. So I would preface it and say, if you didn't like this book, try the second one and then decide, I know that's a lot to ask, but I promise you, that's what happened to me. So I would love to know, hopefully that helps you along your Dark Tower journey as well. But let's kind of get into some of these reviews. I'm pulling up this one here. I really, really, really did not enjoy this. Reading this book was like having a one-sided conversation with a relative who just won't shut up about something. We've all been there before. They waffle on, they go on tangents, and you really want to get up and get a drink, make dinner, and do some laundry. Anything except continue to listen to the madness-inducing dribble that they keep spouting. But for the sake of manners and propriety, you have to endure the endless tirade, even though you'd rather stab yourself in the face. This is harsh. Than have to listen to one more sentence. The prose was trying way too hard. I've described some novels as purple before, but fuck, this one was the darkest shade of purple yet, and not in a good way at all. Pretty sure Stephen King is not the author for me because reading this felt like homework, and I had to force myself to finish it. I'm so happy it is over, and I will not be continuing the series. I'm sorry our first buddy read adventure wasn't a more pleasant experience, Anthony. Sorry, Anthony. Still keen to see the movie, though. I don't know if you're going to be saying that. I guess was written probably before the movie came out. But once you read the reviews, we try to pretend around here that the movie didn't happen. You know, what movie? What are you talking about? I don't know about any Dark Tower movie. I only know about the upcoming Mike Flanagan adaptation. So that's how I choose to deal with that. But so let's dissect this a minute. Besides being utterly hilarious, I do feel like this one does tend to ramble a little bit. And I agree with that. The pacing is very uneven. Really, it's the last half of it. I would even say the last third of it that has the most consequence to the story at hand. I do feel that it is better on a reread. And that's a tall order. But if you ever make your way through the whole Dark Tower series and you read this again, you can see all the foreshadowing that's in place for where the series is going to end up. But you just don't have the context before. So you're just like, what the heck are you talking about? But I would almost consider this like a prologue to the series rather than an actual entry. That's my personal opinion about it. It says the prose was trying way too hard. I will agree with that in some respects. Like, I think Stephen King was probably a young writer at the time. And he had, he's putting his kind of writing stamp out there. And he's still figuring out his style. So I could have just imagined that being an issue, but I did not feel the same way in even subsequent entries because he wrote these so many years apart. I think the second book didn't come out until 1986, so it was 4 years after that. This third one was like 1991, fourth one was 1997 or 8. So, there was huge gaps and you could see him evolve heavily as a writer between entries. So that was a great review. I just feel bad for this reviewer because they're not going to be continuing the series when it's like, oh, you're so close to striking gold. You're this close, But, I understand. Not everybody is a Stephen King addict like me. So that was this review. Let's go to the next review here. I'm pulling it up. I don't want to talk about it. I'm just going to block this book out, act like it never happened. See, that's what I feel about the movie, honestly. But, all right, well, that wasn't very descriptive at all. But, I think a lot of people get really turned off by this book. And it's sad because it's like, this is not indicative of Stephen King's writing style at all, And people dismiss Stephen King's writing based on one reading experience. But this was not the best place to start. I would say if you want to start Stephen King, start with a classic like Pet Sematary or something, a standalone. Don't, go into a 7-book series right away. Start something shorter if you can. I don't think the long behemoths are really for you right at the outset because you're getting used to his style and his style also evolved. So that's my thought on that one. Let's look at this one. Unsavory protagonist sacrifices blank in attempt to arrive at clandestine rendezvous with elusive hipster. That is an amazing review. That is fantastic. It's not too far off, actually, either. If you want the TLDR of this book, this is the review for you. But I do feel like it's so much more because, Roland is this kind of almost mechanical machine-like person who has the singular quest for the Dark Tower. And he's willing to sacrifice anything to get it. And the metaphor in it is really heavy for, like, the idea of going through the motions in life and suddenly being turned on to a purpose and not knowing why, I think it's just a fantastic book when you kind of zoom out and you don't look at all the little nitty-gritty details. But that was a hilarious review. I love that. Okay, let's look at this one here. Honestly, this is one of Stephen King's worst books. It was incredibly boring for the majority of this book. I agree to disagree here, but he also talked about a lot of things and people as if we should know them already, which was frustrating since he did it so often and took so long to explain it. I actually agree with that. I think, he kind of pushes you right into the story, almost Steven Erikson style in some ways. Like you don't have a context. Steven Erikson is the author of Malazan Book of the Fallen. So he drops you right in the world and you have to kind of fend for yourself. It is a bit dizzying, and this particular book, the first half, does feel a lot like that. You just don't know where the character's going. And it's kind of a great part of the journey when you look at it from the broader context. But it says, also the main character is frustrating. He was not interesting at all, and he kept doing things he knew he shouldn't. His motivation was also very confusing. He gave off very condescending vibes. So I also feel Stephen King writes himself into the gunslinger's role. I think he saw himself as the gunslinger in some ways because he talks about in interviews how he couldn't put down the idea of writing this and it just kept gnawing at him over the years. And, as a budding young writer, there probably was some presumptuousness, that you kind of wean out of yourself through life experience, expanding your worldview, writing more books, right? Getting better at your craft, suffering the highs and lows that come with a career like that. So, and then he dealt with his demons too in the 80s, right? So I could just imagine, because when you read the second book, Gunslinger is very different. And, as he starts to evolve, I know Stephen King was also evolving as a person. And the way Stephen King deals with certain tragedies in his life, and he kind of finds a way to use that as an outlet in his books, which I'm not saying anything to spoil anything here, but I really do feel that that is something that makes Stephen King great. So that's my diatribe about that. But it says, definitely felt like the second book in a series, not the first. See, I would disagree with that. I would say it feels more like the prologue than the first book. But I do feel like it's a weird first entry. So that was The Gunslinger. Let's go on to some other reviews. Okay, let's go to It, because this is a very popular book. I'm going to read a couple of these here. Let's go to the first one here. The time will be spent on any other book, avoid It. This is a hard book to read. Builds slowly, characters are weak and one-dimensional. Completely disagree, by the way. You never feel that you actually know any of the characters. Hard to get to a visual of what they look like, act, or behave like if you ever met them in real life. See, I completely disagree with this. I think, respectfully, of course, but I think the thing that made this book so great was it was more than Pennywise. Anyone who doesn't know, I'm sure it has become a pop culture phenomenon now about this scary clown that is terrorizing kids, and killing them, and by feeding on their worst nightmares and things like that, and they have to come back 28 years later to finish what they started as adults. It's a coming of age story as much as it is a horror novel, but I think what separates it from a typical horror novel is it's not about the action. Pennywise doesn't even appear in a ton of the book. Now, every appearance is impactful and purposeful, but it's really about the idea of growing older as well, through the confines of a horror story. So I feel like the Losers Club in it, the group of friends, every character. Henry Bowers, the bully, everybody very intimately. You understand their messiness, you understand their motivations. So I completely disagree with this, but hey, agree to disagree. Descriptive passages are anemic and lack depth. Again, it is hard to connect to the story and events. Seems like many pages or extra prose that adds little to the story. It, no pun intended, was hard to slug through, oftentimes felt like putting it down for good, and used my time on the many better books I have in the queue. I continued to read it and finally dragged on through to the bitter end. Hopefully this review will convince you to avoid my mistake. So many other amazing books to read. Do not waste a second here. I gotta say, I just disagree with this review inherently, because I feel that the character work is really what separates this book. So if you like really good character work and you want to listen to me, I guess, instead of this review, then definitely check out It. But it is long. It's a long book. It's 1,000, close to 1,100 pages, I think, if I remember correctly. And so it is not for the faint of heart. It is a journey, but it's one where, you kind of sit back and get to let King's words wash over you. I don't think it's a first starting point for people, though, who are starting King. So that's my thought on that. Let's go to the next review here. This book didn't make me cry of terror. It made me cry of boredom. And the only thing scary about it is how many pages it has. So I feel, a lot of people who go into King's horror works go into it for action sequences, which they are going to be disappointed, because King is not an action writer. He's not like a Blake Crouch. He's not like, he's not writing things from a beach read kind of a perspective, if that makes sense. Like, it's not all plot. In fact, Stephen King always talks about, if you rely on plot as the first thing to drive a story forward, you're doing it wrong. So that's his personal philosophy on writing, right? So obviously he's going to write character first. And so there is a lot of character work in this, which I think personally makes the terrors more terrifying, because you're more invested in the characters. You care more about what happens to them. So I gotta say, I disagree with this. I think if you're going in expecting an action thriller novel, you'll probably be disappointed, as you would be with most of his works, because it's about characters and depth and meaning. Let's go to another book. Let's try Cujo from 1982. Now, this was Stephen King's most harrowing book in a lot of ways. It talks about a rabid dog, but it's so much more than that. It's like, what if a childhood best friend, a companion, turns rabid? Are they monsters? Are they victims themselves? Beautiful book, heartbreaking book. I think it's one of Stephen King's best, honestly. It was also one where he was very much under the influence of drugs, and he doesn't actually even remember writing it. He even wrote some passages from the dog's perspective. The guy is insane, right? But that's why we love him. So let's read some of these Cujo 1-star reviews. This book is about a rabid dog, but the dog is rarely there. WTF, Steven. Boring as hell. Love the cover, though. I gotta say, that part I'll agree with. I do love the cover. I also agree, yeah, the rabid dog is less present, but again, it's not just an action book. I think it's important to remember that, you know, horror can be so many things. Horror can be family. Horror can be being confined in one space. There's a claustrophobia that comes from it. Horror could be the heat coming into the car as they're like waiting, you know, in there for somebody to come and rescue them. You know, it's like horror can come from so many things. Horror could be seeing a loved one, a companion, a dog turn rabid. Like, what do you do in that situation, you know? So I think horror can come in many different forms, and that's what makes this book so compelling, is it has all those things in that one 280-page book, I think it is. So I have to disagree with this, but I do love the cover. That is a fantastic cover. I'm putting it up here on the screen if you want to check that out. But yeah, fantastic cover, great book. Disagree, but hey, I respect it. Here's the second review I'm pulling up. Norin says, bad dog equals bad book, at least for me. Well, probably not a good idea to read a book about a rabid dog if you don't like depictions of dogs in bad situations, right? Probably not the best choice for reading. I will say, you know, it's tough because I'm a dog lover personally. I grew up with dogs, so the idea of a rabid dog would make me really sad to read. And ordinarily, I probably wouldn't pick up a book like this because I don't like to see animals hurt. I don't like to see them in distress. But Stephen King knows how to juxtaposition it with compelling characters around this dog, right? There's a family that is affected by this dog. There's a family that owns the dog, and they all have interpersonal relationships that are very complex. And that's what makes this book so compelling, because it's like it takes place within, I think, like a block radius, you know, it's like a very small confined area of a couple different houses in this neighborhood, and in this kind of rural neighborhood. And so you get to know these people on an intimate level as well. And of course, the dog is in some ways a manifestation of some of the horror that they are internally going through as well. So really, really great stuff. So I would recommend, if you don't like to see animals be distressed, take it with a grain of salt, take it with some caution. Here's another review. A rabid dog isn't scary, it's sad. Yeah, it is sad. I gotta say, the rabid dog part is very sad. It was very tough to read, but I will say that the interesting thing about Cujo is they even talk about this idea is like, if a rabid dog is rabid, when you're face to face with a killer like that, right? Or who has killer intentions, in that moment, what do you feel like? Oh, you're face to face with a monster, right? If you were to zoom out of that situation, yes, the dog is a victim as much as the people that it affects. But of course, in that moment of visceral terror, if you're right there face to face, then you're going to feel that it is a horror story. Okay, so let's go to another book, Misery. Now, this one is very famous, of course, in the pop cultural lexicon, with Kathy Bates and James Caan's wonderful performance in that film, which I think is one of the best Stephen King adaptations as well. Even the changes they made in it actually are quite good and serve the movie version of the story really well. This is about an author. You know, Stephen King loves to write authors who gets in a car crash, wakes up in a house where his number one fan is taking care of him. But is she taking care of him, trying to keep him safe, or is she trying to keep him all to herself? So that's kind of the idea of the book. Really fascinating stuff. Great character study. I'm going to pull up a couple of reviews here from Misery. Are torture porn and poorly written. I don't agree on this. Like, I think that there's in-depth character exploration, both of Paul Sheldon, the author, and Annie Wilkes, his caretaker. And I feel like you get to see things both from each perspective, and you almost feel like Annie Wilkes toes that line between, oh, maybe it was just misunderstood, and then goes full on into it, you know? So really, there's a cat and mouse game there. Poorly written, I would completely disagree on. Torture porn, I would also disagree on. Yes, there are kind of some tortuous scenes. They are difficult to read, but it's not gratuitous. It serves the story, you know. Annie Wilkes, I don't want to spoil anything. I'm just gonna say it serves the story. I don't agree with the torture porn thing, but I do feel like, yeah, there are some, you know, points where you feel like what Paul Sheldon goes through in the book is tortuous, and it should be so because of the nature of his circumstance. Let's put it that way. Let's read the second review of Misery. Being inside Paul's head was torture. A lot of torture references here. I was not impressed or scared by any of the violence because it was written at a snail's pace. Annie should have chopped this book in half because only the second part has a plot. I don't agree with this. I think character makes plot compelling. Otherwise, it's just plot. And what's the point of that? You know, it's like plot is like maybe, I don't know if this is the right analogy, but like, let's say it is the vegetables in a sandwich or something like that, right? Or the condiments in a sandwich. You don't want just the condiments, or you don't want just the vegetables. Maybe you want some chicken in there or something like that, right? So anyways, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm just hungry. I'm filming this before I eat breakfast, so that could be part of it. But yeah, no, I feel that the idea of seeing things from Paul's perspective is the natural way for a story like this to progress, because he is the one who's in this house, right? And he is trying to figure kind of remember what happened with this crash and how did he end up here and how do I, what do I do next, things like that. So I do feel that the violence is earned, and I feel like it's paced in a way that allows those characters to feel, you feel more for Paul, and you find Annie more and more frightening as the book goes. But there's a subtlety to that, right? If she just comes out and is frightening from the get-go, not much of a story there. There's got to be a little unfolding of these psychoses and the twisted nature of King's horror characters. So I think it's great. I would definitely check it out. And it's actually a smaller book, so this would be a good place to start, I would even say, for King. Let's talk a little bit about Pet Sematary. Pet Sematary is another book that is in the pop culture lexicon about a family who moves into a house with a pet cemetery in their backyard, where if you bury things, maybe something happens to them. So I'm just going to leave it there. Very interesting meditation on grief, on alcoholism, something that King was going through at the time, family dynamics, and of course, what would you be willing to do if you could have your loved ones back again? What price would you be willing to pay? Great slow burn dread. Great place to start for Stephen King. Let's read one of these 1-star reviews here. Well, this book sucks. All the real action is in the last dozen chapters, and it's not even that scary. So, again, if you want just plot-driven beach reads, King is just not for you. If you want characters that make you feel the horror because you get to feel for the characters and you're invested in the characters and you feel like you know them intimately, then King is definitely the author for you. I don't think that this is one of those plot-driven thrillers. It's meant to be scary because to understand what a family goes through to make them go, I am going to do whatever it takes to get my family or my loved ones back again. And their complex relationship with the loved ones of their past. That's what makes it more interesting, So I do feel like, that's what makes the horror more horrifying. But if you focus only on action, you're going to be disappointed. Just like, when you watch a movie, the scares build up, right? In a horror movie, they're not just like maybe you'll have a jump scare at the beginning, then you have it kind of pull back. The scares kind of build, right? There's tension there that's building. So you need to have a little bit of that, and especially so in long form novels. So that's my take on that. Let's read a second 1-star review of Pet Sematary here. All right, just found it boring. Those claiming this is the scariest book ever, I'm not seeing what you're seeing. Also, why is there so much focus on the cat's balls, lack thereof? Well, it's because it's King, you guys, and King's weirdness always is worn on his sleeve. So don't really know about the cat's balls focus as much, but I will address, again, the scariest book ever. So scares can happen in many different ways. I think scares can happen if something is outright scary. Some scares can happen by the contextual reference of what you know about the story and its characters. So I do feel like I think that this is scary because of the build up to the scares. So that's what I'll say about that. But I have rambled on about Pet Sematary enough. Let's go to the final book on my list here, and that is the one, the only, The Stand. The Stand is a post-apocalyptic thriller that Stephen King does so well in his 1187 pages of his expanded edition, which is the one I read, and I personally loved it. I thought the pacing was actually really great for such a large book. Every character you get to know, you get to see the before the apocalypse, the after apocalypse. What do survivors do? How do they carry on? Is there a broader kind of a war between the remaining survivors brewing? It's biblical in its proportions. It's got a Lord of the Rings-esque kind of scope to it, I think, in some ways, for a horror novel. Of course, it's not that, but it is reminiscent of that, if that makes sense. So I'm going to read a couple of these reviews as well and kind of comment on them. At least 3 of my friends recommended this book to me. I don't think I'm going to hang out with these dudes anymore. King can spin a good yarn. Misery and Thinner are pretty good. I will agree with that. This story, however, was spread a little too thin. No, way too thin. I guess he was going for some kind of Lord of the Rings epic, but it came across as just an overlong tweetathon. I don't know what that means, but that is pretty hilarious. Come on, man. You gotta hang out with your friends. They have good book recommendations. So I will say that spread a little too thin. I don't necessarily agree. I think, again, it's one of those things where Stephen King does build-ups really well. I will say the way it ended, you know, some people do have comments that it was a little bit abrupt for the ending, but I thought the buildup was fantastic to that. I think it was kind of earned, if that makes sense. So I don't agree with that. You also get to see a character in this book that becomes a mainstay in some of his other books, including the Dark Tower series. So there's a lot of connections to King's larger works in this one. So that's what I feel about that one. Let's read another 1-star review. If it were possible to punch a book in the face, I would do it. Lazy, self-indulgent, boring. So love that imagery. Don't know I necessarily agree. I think it could be self-indulgent at times. It was one of his earlier works, you know, and I think Stephen King evolved as a writer in some respects. In that respect, I think a lot of people would probably disagree with me on that, but I don't feel it was boring. I don't feel like it was lazy. I don't want to punch the book in the face. I wouldn't want to hit anyone in the face with this book either because it's a behemoth, but that's how I feel about it. Let's read another one. Okay, this is a great way to end this little segment. I was astounded by overhyped this book was. This was my first and probably last time reading a Stephen King book. Now, first of all, it's Stephen King with a PH, not a V. But you know, if you're going to start your Stephen King journey, don't start with The Stand, I would say, because it's just so massive. You know, you don't want to start with like something like that. That's something you build up towards. I had always heard about how awesome this book was supposed to be, so I decided to read it. It was interesting initially because I was under the impression it was going somewhere, which it did. As I got further into the book and it still hadn't gone anywhere, I assumed the last 150 pages would be the most intense storyline of all time because of all the hype surrounding this book. And then I realized it was never going anywhere. None of the characters' actions accomplished anything. You could erase 99% of the book and it wouldn't impact the plot at all. Not true. I mean, okay, you could say the plot could be boiled down to 3 different things, right, that happen. There's the before, there's the after, and there's kind of what happens at the end, this final kind of thing that happens at the end. Sure, but it's the connective tissue in between those events that give it any meaning. Otherwise, who cares? You know, you could read that in a log line, right, and then you'd be done. You wouldn't ever need to read books again, right? It's just like there are books that are character studies as much as they are what happens. So I don't agree with that. I think character development, character growth is a huge part of any compelling story. So that's my take on that. The villain was pathetic. He acted creepy and killed a couple of people, but was really just a bunch of sound and fury that accomplished nothing. The protagonists were utterly useless. They didn't do anything to affect the plot at all. Completely disagree. And if you read other Stephen King works, you'll see why this villain is indeed as creepy. But if you read just this one, didn't read any more, he's creepy for a reason, you know? He's a foreboding, imposing, oppressive presence. So definitely disagree with that. It says they didn't do anything to affect the plot at all. The whole book was completely meaningless. Not worth the time wasted reading it. So as you could tell, we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one. I don't think that it was meaningless. I think the journey is as important as where the characters end up. And so sometimes even more so. And this book is a lot about the journey and not just about where they end up. So you know, you care about characters because of the journey that they go through, not where they end up, right? So these are some 1-star reviews of Stephen King's most popular works. I would love to know what you thought. Did you agree, disagree with any of these? Like, I would love to know. I know this is a little bit of a longer video, but I figured this would be kind of a fun Stephen King thing to do. Let me know what you think. I'm Nikhil with Shelf-Esteem. I appreciate you being here watching. If this is the first time watching and you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. Let me know if you would want more 1-star review reactions as well. This is kind of a little experiment on the channel. But in the meantime, be good to yourselves, be good to each other. As always, I will see you on the next video. Take care.